I was working on the novel. It took me 3 years to write, and we're not talking about scratching the side of my face and looking at the horizon. We're talking about hours and hours each day, which I still do. I have hours in which I write, and sometimes it's okay, and sometimes it's not okay. But if you don't write, if you're waiting for it, it's not going to happen. So I was working on the book and working on it, and I didn't have a name for the character. And this is no lie. I would be typing along when the character's name would occur. I'd go, this because we're in the typewriter era. I'd hit the space bar and for whatever length the name would be, and then I'd continue. So my manuscript pages had all these blank spots for the name. And my dear wife, who has been of immense help to me throughout my career, she's very wise and sometimes prompts me even when she doesn't know it. She and our young daughter, infant daughter, had gone out. We had very little money. And I mean, really very little money. And she had gone out and found this roadside stand, and she'd bought some apples that were cheap. Hey, cheap apples. So she tasted one, and it was delicious. But it wasn't a delicious apple. I mean, it tasted good. And we had a bedroom and a living room that was also a kitchen in graduate housing. And so I was in our bedroom, which had the playpen where our daughter slept, and I'm in our little desk, and the genius is at work. And she says, "Hey, I bought some apples. They taste really good. Do you want one?" Yeah. So I'm busy. And she says, "No, and I love the mythology here. You should taste this apple." So to get rid of her, I said, "All right, give me the apple," bit into it. And indeed, it tasted very good. And I did what everybody will do in that circumstance. "This tastes pretty good. What's it called?" And she said, "It's a Rambo apple." And bang. Now, I like to, when I talk to writers, I say, remember, you're professionals and the rest of the world is amateurs. So somebody else would say that was interesting, and that would be the end of it. But if you're a professional writer, you seize on anything that interests you. And I seized on that. I said, "What? Spell it." And she said, Rambo. Now, many people listening to this may not have heard of the apple, but I assure you, in central Pennsylvania, it is well known. And if we want to add some historic context, these Rambo apples were what Johnny Appleseed, whose real name is John Chapman, planted in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana. And there's still some, they don't bear fruit anymore, but there's still somehow some of those Rambo apple trees in existence. I mean, they don't look so good, but they're still. And the name is a Scandinavian name. It's a apple variety from Scandinavia, which Rambo means mountain dweller. So you can see I did a lot of research. And anyhow, I leapt on it. I knew immediately that that was the name I wanted. And he does not have a first name in the novel. So when people say I created John Rambo, I do not recognize this. There is no John Rambo in my novel. There is just Rambo and the inexorable force. So at Penn State, and I'll try to get this shorter, at Penn State, when I was working on the novel, and the novel came out of experiences in 1968, which seems it's the Stone Age, I know, but until recently, 1968, well, it still was the most, in memory anyhow, the most violent year in domestic American history. Because of the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy Jr., because of the Vietnam War, because of civil rights issues, which are beginning to become to major force. There weren't 10 riots, there weren't 20 riots, there weren't 50 riots, there weren't 100 riots, there were several hundred riots. And many cities, such as Gary, Indiana, Detroit, and inner LA never recovered. To this day, the results of those riots can be seen. And I was a Canadian in graduate school at an American university at Penn State. And my wife and I had been told as we crossed the border that we were guests and we did not have a right to an opinion about what happened in the United States. Fair enough. If I go to somebody's house, I'm not going to raise a fuss about what they have to say if I'm a guest, right? Not on the street, it might be a different matter. I'm an American citizen now, but I am Canadian to my core and relentlessly polite. So all this was going on and I couldn't say anything. I couldn't talk to anybody about my confusion about what was happening in the United States. But I thought there was going to be a civil war. I mean, the march, the riot, which the United States government described as a police riot that occurred outside the Democratic Convention in Chicago. And that's not to take sides because Lord knows the radical left did their own rioting in '68. But all this together, I said, maybe, why don't I write a novel that makes an allegory of this? And I'll have a Vietnam veteran, a decorated, highly decorated Vietnam veteran, come back to the United States and see what he's been fighting for. And he will have been so angered by what happened to him in Vietnam. It's not like, you know, the pleasant veneer that the movies cast over Vietnam. It was a rough, to say the least, as you were saying, for people who have PTSD and all that, a lot of people never recovered from Vietnam. And that he would come back and he would, as it were, wind up in a situation like what, say, was playing on TV every night between riots on this side and riots on that side. And I had an idea that Rambo would be a version of Audie Murphy, who was America's most decorated soldier of World War II. And what would happen if Audie Murphy came back, grew long hair and a beard, because that's how Rambo looks in the novel, a trigger for law enforcement in the '60s. Now the right, now people on the right look like that, but at that time it was people on the left, and law enforcement would automatically. I know this because I grew a mustache, which I still have, at the time, just as a modest attempt to see how I would be treated by authority figures. And oh boy, it was revealing. The contempt and the insults. I'd walk down the street and police officers actually would insult me as I passed them. So I thought, we'll set this up, but I didn't. You described the police officer in a very negative way. I subscribe to the idea of what Plato has Socrates say in one of the dialogues: nobody does evil intentionally. Everybody has an excuse for what they do. So I was determined to make that police officer, that police chief, as sympathetic as I possibly could. He came from Korea, the Korean conflict, was a war hero there, and had no, you know, in his world, what was going on to demonstrate against the Vietnam War, that was unthinkable. And his wife had just left him, and there were a whole bunch of other issues. And at one point early in the novel, he says, all right, my life's going to hell, but I still have my profession. I'm good at what I do. And I will not cut corners on being a police officer. And so what I did is I set up the novel so we have Teasel seeing Rambo and automatically reacting to the hair and the beard. It's just a button. And then Rambo looking at Teasel and having the same button issues. Whenever we're in one of their viewpoints, we hate the other guy. Whenever we switch over to the other guy, we hate the first guy. And so we don't know, there are no heroes. The reviewers could not tell who was supposed to be the focal character because the plot flip-flopped like that. And so that we wouldn't be unable to choose, so that when the cataclysm occurred at the end, there would be what I hoped, a catharsis.